The man who framed her walked back in. He had no idea who she worked for now. Wesley Kane walked back into Imani Carter's life on a Tuesday, in a room built entirely of glass, and he smiled at her across it like a man who had no notion at all that the floor beneath his own feet had already been rigged to open. But before we go 1 inch further into what happened in that glass room, let me ask you something, because I need to know I'm not the only one. Have you ever watched a person walk back into your life who was certain, absolutely certain, that they had finished you off years ago? Who looks at you and sees the corpse they left behind and never once considers that the dead learn things? If that lands anywhere in you, then you are exactly who I wrote this one for. So do yourself one favor before we go a step further. Tap that like button and hit subscribe, because a new story like this one goes up every single week and you do not want to be the person who misses the next one. Stay with me to the end, because Imani is about to teach a man the difference between a woman who's been buried and a woman who simply went quiet. And drop a comment right now, before you know how it turns out. When someone who wronged you walks back in smiling, do you let them see your face change, or do you go smooth and empty and let them dig their own hole? Lock it in. We'll come back to it. She was 3 months into the new life by then. 3 months of standing at the right hand of Yoon Sok Jin and turning one language into another with the same clean precision she'd once spent hiding behind an apron. She had learned the rhythm of it again, the old muscle waking up, the 7 tongues living in her mouth like a second skeleton, always there, always holding her upright. She had almost let herself believe the past was a closed book. And then the elevator on the 51st floor opened, and out stepped the opposing party's newly retained language consultant, and it was him. Older, greyer at the temple, that same unbothered, easy smile she had watched him give her across a conference table, the morning her whole world tipped over. The deal on the table that morning was the largest Sok Jin had put in front of her yet. A logistics acquisition, 9 figures. His holding company against a consortium out of Houston that had lawyered up heavily and, evidently, decided at the last hour that they needed their own interpreter in the room, someone to shadow every word Imani rendered and challenge anything that served the other side. That was standard. That was fair. Even. What was not standard was that the consortium's chair, a lean, careful man named Okafor, had been steered toward a particular consultant by a particular introduction, and the man who made that introduction, Imani would learn before the day was out, was Spencer Walsh. Lachlan Pierce's vice president, the one who had sent 2 men down a Buckhead sidewalk after her 3 months ago, and who had spent every week since nursing the specific patient hatred of a person who does not lose gracefully. Walsh had gone looking for a way to hurt Yoon Sok Jin, and what he had found, digging through the wreckage of Imani's old life, was Wesley Kane. Sok Jin stood when she entered the boardroom, the way he always did, the way he'd never once failed to, and she caught the flicker in Wesley's expression when he saw it. A crime boss she plainly didn't yet understand the reach of, rising from his chair for a woman Wesley had personally reduced to nothing. It rearranged something in his face for half a second before the smile slid back over it. "Imani," he said warmly, as though they'd parted friends. "My goodness. Small world. Mr. Kane," she said, and gave him nothing. Not the flinch he was fishing for. Not the flash of old wound he'd come to feed on. She had spent 8 months teaching her face to go smooth and empty while her pulse did something else entirely, and that skill, it turned out, did not expire. She sat. She poured her water. She waited for the room to begin. It went badly for Wesley almost at once, though he was too pleased with himself to feel it. His job was to catch her in an error, to introduce doubt, to make Sok Jin's own people wonder whether the woman translating for them could be trusted. But Imani did not make errors. She rendered Okafor's Portuguese asides to his second exactly, then rendered Sok Jin's Korean exactly, then caught Wesley softening a hard clause in his own back translation, the reversion language on the warehouse leases, bending it a degree toward Houston's favor, betting nobody on Sok Jin's side would notice. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She had watched him do precisely this to 100 documents in another life, and she'd carried the blame for all of it. She let him finish. Then, evenly, to Sok Jin, in Korean, she laid the real sentence down beside the false one, and let the two of them sit there together in the open, harmless looking as a folded napkin and twice as lethal. Sokjin's eyes moved, once, from her to Wesley and back. He said nothing. Nothing was required. Across the table, Okafor, who understood more than he'd let on, gave a small dry cough into his fist and looked at his own consultant with the first crack of doubt. They broke for the noon recess with the deal unsigned, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and that was when Wesley made his move, because men like Wesley always mistake a delay for an opening. He caught her by the windows while the room emptied. Jang was 4 feet away, folded into the architecture, and Wesley either didn't see him or didn't count him, which told Imani a great deal about how little Wesley had actually learned in 3 years. "You've done well for yourself," he said, low, that oil back in his voice. "The waitress rumour, I wasn't sure I believed it. And now look." Right hand to a very frightening man. He tilted his head. "Does he know what you are, Imani? Does he know his interpreter lost her license for fraud? Because I have the file. The whole file. I could put it in front of Mr. Okafor by 2 o'clock and salt the ground under this deal and every deal after it. Or," he spread his hands, "generous, reasonable, exactly the way he'd looked the morning he settled on her as the fall guy and slept fine the night before. You could translate a little kindly this afternoon, round a few corners my way, for old times, and nobody has to learn who's really been standing in the corner of Yoon Sok-jin's rooms." There it was, bare and ugly and entirely familiar. "And this is the part where I have to stop again, because I need you to feel the size of what's being asked of her," Wesley Kane framed this woman once. Took her name, her firm, her savings, her whole life, and pinned it on her so cleanly that a courtroom full of people who spoke her 7 languages could not undo it. And now he's back, 3 years later, offering her the one thing that broke her the first time, silence, in exchange for her soul. And here's what he doesn't know. Here's the thing Spencer Walsh's money couldn't buy him in any file. Imani already carries 4 Korean words in her pocket that she hasn't answered yet, from a man who told her, plainly, over a cooling cup of tea, that he was betting on her honesty and not bracing against it. So before she opens her mouth, tell me down in the comments, what would you do standing at that window, take the deal, and stay buried? Or make him regret every word? Drop your answer, smash that like button, and hit subscribe if you already know which one she picked, because a woman who walked away from the best-paying job she had, rather than let a lie stand, is not, I promise you, about to start rounding corners now. Let's find out how she does it. She didn't answer Wesley at the window. She said, mildly, "I'll consider it," and watched the satisfaction bloom across his face, the certainty of a man who thinks he's just reset the board to a game he knows how to win. Then she went, at the noon recess, not to Sok-jin, but to a quiet stairwell, and she made 2 calls. The first was to her mother, the second was to Jang. Because here is what Wesley Kane, in all his careful research, had failed to account for. When Yoon Sok-jin took her on 3 months back, he had not simply hired an interpreter. He had, without being asked, put people on the question of who had destroyed her out of what she'd eventually understood was a kind of quiet, dangerous tenderness. He did not have the English, or maybe any language to name. He had told her once, across the tea, that the evidence now indicated her fraud case was constructed top to bottom by her partner, and that Wesley Kane had since been connected to 2 close variations of the same scheme in 2 other cities. What Sok-jin had not told her, because she had asked him to keep his world and her work separate, and he had honoured it to the letter, was that his people already held the thread that tied all 3 cities together. They had been holding it for 3 months, waiting, the way a still man waits, for the day it might be needed. Wesley had just walked into the one city in the country where his old machine had already been quietly reverse-engineered, and handed them the reason to pull. She laid it all out in the stairwell, fast and precise, and Jang listened without a word and then said only, "Mr. Yoon will want to be the one to tell you it's handled." "No," Imani said. "Tell him I want to handle this one myself. In the room, his resources, my voice." A pause, on the line, then something that, from Jang, counted as open delight. "He is going to enjoy that," Jang said, and hung up. The afternoon session convened at 2. Okafor and his second, Seokjin, still as deep water, Wesley, smiling, waiting for his rounded corners. And Imani, who set her portfolio down, poured her water, and then did not translate the first thing anyone said. Instead, she turned to Okafor and spoke to him directly, in his own Portuguese, clean and unhurried, telling him that before this deal went one clause further, he deserved to know that the language consultant seated at his elbow had, in the past 6 years, engineered near-identical fraud on deals in 2 other cities, that documentation of both was in the possession of parties in this building, and that if Mr. Okafor cared to verify it, a courier was waiting in the lobby with a sealed copy addressed to him alone. She said it calmly. She said it the way you set down a linen you've decided to stop pretending is keeping your hands busy. And she watched Wesley Kane's face, which spoke no Portuguese, do the exact thing her own face had refused to do 3 years ago in a courtroom, come apart in real time, in a language he could not follow, while the table nodded and rolled forward around him. "What is she saying?" Wesley said, too loud. "What did you just Okafor? Whatever she just told you is a lie. She's a convicted..." "She lost her license for this exact." "I know what she lost her license for," Okafor said, in English now mild as milk. "You just spent all morning making sure I knew." "Odd, isn't it, how badly you wanted me looking at her?" He opened the folder the courier had brought up. He read for a while. The room held very still. Then Okafor closed the folder and looked at Wesley Kane, the way you look at a term in a problem you've just finished solving, and said, "Get your things." And Wesley Kane gathered his jacket and walked out of a glass room without a single syllable left in him, and the door swung shut behind him with a small, polished click that carried more finality than any slam. In the quiet after, Seokjin looked at her across the table, and the thing on his face was the least guarded she had ever seen it in daylight. He said, in Korean, low, not quite to the room, "There she is," and Imani, rendering for the record out of pure reflex, translated it under her breath before she could stop herself, and then heard what she'd said, and looked up, and neither of them looked away for a moment longer than was strictly professional. The deal closed by 4. It closed fair. Both sides left with what they'd come in for, which she had come to understand was its own kind of quiet miracle in the rooms she now lived in. And the file on Wesley Kane, the whole file, the 3 cities' worth, went somewhere that afternoon that Imani did not ask about and Seokjin did not offer, except to say, once, in the elevator down in careful English, "Your name." The old case. He paused, choosing. "It is being reopened. By people who want it reopened. Not buried." He looked straight ahead at the doors. "You will have your license back before the year turns, if you want it." She watched the floors count down. "And if I don't? Car. Then you keep the one you've built," he said. "Either way it is yours. Not his. Never his again." She said nothing. There was nothing she could put against that. She wasn't certain anything existed that could. That evening she went to her mother, and this is where the second thing happened, the thing that had been coming since the first night. Florence was not at Grady anymore. She had not been at Grady for 6 weeks. She was in a bright, quiet room at a specialty centre up north of the city, the kind of place with a garden you could see from the bed, and a name Imani had never dared say out loud in her old life because the cost of it would have shut her throat. Imani had come home one Tuesday 6 weeks back to find the Grady billing statement gone from her table and a single card in its place, cream, thick, that precise weighed hand. Handled, it said. Only that. She had known, of course, whose hand it came from. She had spent 3 days furious about it, and the 4th day sitting at her mother's new window watching Florence breathe easier than she had in a year, and somewhere in there the fury had quietly changed into something she still didn't have a name for. Florence was awake when she came in, sharp as ever, propped against the pillows, and she read her daughter's face the way she'd been reading it for 29 years. All of it, accurately, with no need for a word of setup. "You did something today," Florence said. "I did," said Imani, and sat on the edge of the bed and told her. "All of it," Wesley walking back in. The window, the Portuguese, the file that had been waiting 3 months, and then because her mother's eyes had not once left her face, the rest of it too. The room in Doraville. The way he stood every time she entered. The coffee that was always right. The 4 Korean words in a cream envelope that she still had not answered. The man who paid for this window, this garden, this easier breathing, and asked for nothing, and stood there afterward perfectly still, learning what would become of it. Florence listened without interrupting once, a discipline she'd honed raising a child who needed her listening far more than her advice. When Imani ran out of words, the room held only the soft sounds of the machines and the garden going gold outside the glass. Then Florence said, "The dangerous one." "Yes," said Imani. "The one who did all this?" Florence's hand moved over the blanket, over the window, over the whole bright, easy room. "Yes." Florence was quiet, a long moment. She had known betrayal. She had known 2 jobs across 16 years, and a daughter's name dragged through a court, and the slow shift from planning a life to outlasting an afternoon. And she had never once told that daughter to make herself small enough to fit the life she'd been handed. "I want to meet him," Florence said. And then, because she was Florence, and because she had already half known the answer before she asked, she picked her tablet back up, eased the volume a notch higher on the old movie waiting there, and added, calm and plain and final. "And you already know what those 4 words say. You've known since the sidewalk. You're just frightened it's true." He came on a Sunday. Yoon Sok-jin, who turned restaurant managers into sweating wrecks, who walked into rooms like they'd been his for years, stood in the doorway of a hospital room in a plain dark sweater, with no jang at his shoulder and no armor she could find anywhere on him, holding a small potted orchid, because Imani had mentioned once, in passing, weeks ago, that her mother liked things that bloomed slowly. He had remembered. Of course he had remembered. And when Florence looked up at him, this small, sick, unbreakable woman who had raised a daughter who could hear the lie buried inside a sentence, Imani watched a man who feared nothing be. For one honest second, afraid, he crossed the room, and he did not offer his money or his reach, or a single one of the things that made other people careful around him. He set the orchid on the sill where she could see it. And he said, in slow, deliberate English he had plainly practiced, "Your daughter tells the truth, in rooms full of people who would rather she didn't." I don't know where she learned it. He glanced at Florence, and then away, as if the answer embarrassed him with its obviousness. "I think I am looking at where." Florence studied him for a long, long while, the way she studied everything, all the way down to the foundations. Then she patted the blanket at the edge of the bed, the same spot she patted for her daughter, and said, "Sit down then. You've been standing since you got here. Imani says you do that," and Sok-jin sat. And something in the architecture of the man, some load-bearing wall he'd been holding up his whole dangerous life, eased by a single degree in the gold afternoon light, and Imani, watching from the doorway, felt the last of her fear about the whole impossible thing quietly let go of her, the way you feel a chord resolve a half-second before your mind can name the note. They stayed an hour. Florence made him laugh once. Actually laugh, a startled sound he seemed as surprised by as anyone. When it was time to go, she held his hand a moment longer than a goodbye required, and told him something quiet that Imani didn't catch, and Sok-jin never repeated, though he carried it out of the room on his face like a man who'd been handed something he intended to keep. She read him the 4 words that night. They were standing on the broken sidewalk, under the same split-open magnolia where she'd read them the first time, 3 months and a lifetime ago, because she'd asked him to meet her there and he'd come without asking why. A street musician was working something low out of a saxophone half a block down, a melody with no aim to it, just sound moving through warm air hunting for a place to settle. She took the cream card out of her pocket, the one she'd carried against her heartbeat for 3 months, and she didn't hand it to him. She read it to him, in Korean. In his own language, the 4 words he'd written because English wouldn't hold them. Dangsanun nawi yue han jinsil, you are my only truth. And then she translated it, out loud, for the record, the way she did everything, so there could be no mistaking what had been said, or by whom. "You are my only truth," she said, in English, in her own voice, and gave it back to him. He was very still. He had stood in every kind of dangerous room a person can stand in. Rooms with guns and rooms with lawyers, and rooms where one wrong word ended everything. And she watched him be more undone by 4 of his own words in her mouth than by any of them. "I meant it the day I wrote it," he said, low. "I mean it more now. I did not know that was possible." The saxophone reached for a note so clean it nearly hurt. "I know what you are," she said, the same words she'd laid down between them over cooling tea in Doraville. Not an accusation, just a fact set gently in the open. "I know exactly what you are." "Yes," he said, the way he always answered that, without a flinch or a sidestep. "And I'm still here," she said, eyes open, every corner of it. That's not a woman who got talked into anything. That's a woman who added it all up and decided. She stepped in, closed the last of the distance she'd been keeping for 3 careful months. "So stop bracing for me to run." Something crossed his face then, unrehearsed, unguarded, so honest, it nearly took her apart. The look of a man who'd held something true out into open air and just, at long last, learned what would become of it. "I'm not bracing," he said. "I'm betting." And the almost smile finally got all the way to being the real thing. The city went on around them exactly the way it always did, warm and loud and stacked and magnificently unbothered, headlights smearing past, music leaking from a doorway down the block, the whole machine humming along with no idea at all what had just been settled on a cracked sidewalk beneath a tree, whose roots had split the concrete wide open and kept right on growing anyway. Very Atlanta, she thought. Very Atlanta. Her license came back before the year turned, just as he'd said. Carter Language Services. Her name alone on the door this time. No partner. Never again a partner. Only her 7 languages and her spotless restored record and a very short, very exclusive client list at the top of which sat exactly one man's holding company. Wesley Kane answered for 3 cities in the end, in the slow, grinding way the law answers when the right file finally lands in the right hands, and Spencer Walsh discovered, quietly and permanently, that there are people in this world it is safer never to make an enemy of, and neither man ever troubled Imani Carter again. Florence kept her window and her garden and her slow-blooming orchid and got stronger through the fall, strong enough by winter to sit at a long table in a warm, dark room in Doraville, at a place called Huaru that isn't on any map, and tell embarrassing childhood stories about her daughter while Zhang, against the far wall, failed completely to keep a straight face. And Imani Carter, who once taught herself to disappear so thoroughly that a room full of powerful men couldn't remember she'd been there, spends her days now in the loudest rooms in the country, dead center, the one voice everyone in them trusts to carry the truth from one language to the next without bending a single degree. She married the dangerous man the following spring, under a magnolia, eyes wide open, and if you want to know whether she ever regretted it, whether a woman who speaks 7 languages ever found the one word for what she'd chosen, the answer is no. There wasn't one word for it. It took all 7, and even then, it spilled over the edges. Some choices cost what they cost. She had tallied this bill a long time ago, on a rooftop 42 floors above Buckhead, the night she set down a stack of linen and decided she was done with the quiet. And she had paid it in full, and it had bought her, of all the impossible things, a life she could hear all the way to the bottom of, with no lie buried anywhere inside it. That's the whole of it. That's where Imani's story ends. And honestly, exactly where she'd want it to. If you rode with these 2 all the way from a lie whispered over champagne to 4 Korean words read aloud under a magnolia, then do me one favor before you go. Tell me down in the comments, did you guess the 4 words right, all the way back at the end of part 1? Some of you called it. I saw you. And tell me this too, the question from the very top, the one I asked before Wesley ever opened his mouth. When someone who wronged you walks back in smiling, do you let them see your face change, or do you go smooth and empty and let them dig their own hole? I've got a feeling this story shifted a few of your answers. So drop it in the comments, best one gets pinned to the top. Hit that like button if Imani earned it, and subscribe if you're not already, because there's a brand new story going up every single week, and every one of them has a woman in it who hears exactly what the room is trying to hide. I'll see you in the next one. The end.